Order à l'autre. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay. Bon après-midi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think the next is the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs.
Good afternoon. My name is Cheyenne Arnold Cunningham, and I'm counsel for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. I will be directing our questions today to Mr. Vigneault, but I welcome the answers of any participant on the panel who may be able to supply additional information. Mr. Vigneault, are you familiar with Bill C-15, which received royal assent and came into force as federal legislation on June 21st, 2021, to adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP?
I'm generally aware of the bill, yes.
So under that legislation, the Government of Canada is required by Parliament to take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are aligned with UNDRIP. How is CSIS meeting this obligation?
That's an interesting question. I think that our work as an organization, we're supporting the government, continues to be making sure that our specific act is respected, that we are, of course, respecting the law, but at the same time that as an organization that we are taking measures and steps internally to make sure that we will live up to our obligation on human rights. I do not have a specific reference to the CSIS Act in relation to UNDRIP.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask next. We noticed in your mandate letter that you've been mandated to advise Minister Mendocino on deficiencies within the CSIS Act that require modernization. So I just wanted to confirm if a review of the CSIS Act for alignment with UNDRIP has been prepared within the agency.
There's been no specific review of the CSIS Act. We have been advocating in my transition advice to Minister Mendocino. I have advised that the Act is close to 40 years old and the world has changed very significantly. And in order to make sure that CSIS was not only able to discharge its national security mandate, but also make sure that we're doing so with the evolving expectations of Canadians vis-a-vis an intelligence organization, that there was a need to modernize the Act. There's some internal discussions at the moment in that respect, but there's been no specific legislative amendment introduced.
Okay, thank you. Does CSIS consider Indigenous rights in conducting its assessments and evaluations?
Actually, we do. And there is one specific document that I have in preparing for the commission's work that I would like maybe council to bring up that in relation to our analysis.
I believe the document that Mr. Vigneault is looking for is ts.nsc.can.0025025.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Can we, sorry, I'm sorry, is it going to be pulled up? Sorry.
I'm going to make note of that document and I'll take a look at it, but I'd like to move on to the next question for...
I'm sorry, there's just one specific element. If you go scroll down, scroll. So there is, just before, go down. Sorry, you're going too fast. Okay, stop, please. So if you look at the last paragraph here, this is something that I'd like to point out, that as an organization, we are obviously not perfect, but I'm very proud of the work that the organization is doing to be aware of how our activities can potentially, impact people. And so the quote here is, despite the lack of concerted Indigenous support for the Ottawa protest, any law enforcement response must be culturally sensitive in an effort to negate any backlash from the broader Indigenous community. And this is, I think it's important to bring this on the record because, as I said, we're not a perfect organization, but we try very hard to make sure that we understand how our actions are perceived because, again, we are an intelligence service that works in a democracy, and we want to make sure that our actions are specifically directed towards threat-related activity and not unduly to other groups.
Okay, thank you. Branching off of that, thank you for bringing that up. Has CSIS considered whether UNDRIP's implementation means that there should be distinct considerations on CSIS's ability to monitor nonviolent and unarmed First Nations people who engage in activism pertaining to their lawful rights, even in situations that are perceived to be public order or emergency events that are allegedly unlawful?
So, as I mentioned earlier, we have not done a full analysis of the intersection between the CSIS Act and UNDRIP. What I can say is that, as I think testament to the document I just pulled out there, we're trying to really understand how we can discharge our mandate as directed by under the law that Parliament has given us, but make sure that we do that in a way that is sensitive to how a lawful protest, including in your question, Council, the Indigenous protest is taking place. We have testified that we cannot monitor, investigate lawful protest and dissent, and our analysis, of events always takes that into account. That is not to say that we will not be, of course, in order to make a determination if there is a threat to security. Of course, we look at a number of different issues, and I think there were some documents that recently were released on the Access to Information Act that concluded that CSIS advised government that maybe some Indigenous protests did not constitute a threat to the security of Canada, which is, I think, an important point to make sure that people understand when there are potentially law enforcement action, they understand how we see it from our own mandate's point of view.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to wrap up with just a few last questions. So in your mandate letter in May 2022, Minister Mendicino mandated that CSIS must work to eliminate any systemic racism or unconscious bias in its operations. He specifically made reference to ensuring that, quote, minority communities, unquote, are not subject to unfair scrutiny in the name of national security, and that CSIS, quote, ensure the intelligence and evidence used when making determinations are free of bias, prejudice, and up to date, unquote. What work is CSIS doing or planning specifically to eliminate anti-Indigenous discrimination in its operations, monitoring, intelligence gathering and analysis, or reporting to other government branches or agencies, specifically in the context of Indigenous rights defenders?
I would say that there are probably three main aspects of our work. The first one is, I think, as exemplified by the document I pulled out, our intelligence professionals within the organization are trained and continue to receive training to better understand, how the work that they do might be perceived, how it would impact, different communities differently, and to make sure that they have this awareness. So that the aspect of training is an important one. The other aspect is, as an organization, in terms of our management of our organization, how do we make sure that we bring diversity, that we continue to work to have a much more diverse organization, that we understand that, some of our policies and procedures might not intended to be biased, but the net effect might be systemic racism, and we want to understand how this works, and we take measures to correct that internally in our own procedures. And finally, I would say we have launched a very specific stakeholder outreach program to make sure that we understand and we meet with communities that we had the chance personally early in my tenure to meet with the Assembly of First Nations to establish some contacts, some ability to talk to each other. So if there are any concerns, any issues, that we have those lines of communications open, because it is very complex work that CSIS professionals do, and we want to make sure that we understand how it is being received and perceived by the population we serve.
Okay, and last question. Do you have any specific Indigenous officials working in those advisory positions, whether it be an advisory body, an internal committee, or just an advisor to advise on matters such as making sure, surveillance of ideologically motivated activism doesn't suppress legitimate activism by Indigenous peoples regarding their rights?
I would point out to two specific bodies, if you want. One is an internal one. It's called the Black Indigenous Persons of Color Congress within CSIS, the BIPOC Congress. So I personally meet with them. The meeting was probably a month and a half ago, where we are sitting down and looking at our specific strategies, plans to make sure that we get their input before it is our policies are changed. So we want the input, we want co-development of some of these approaches. So that is an internal one. And the second one, I would say, is not as much an advisory body, but the fact that our activities are reviewed by two specific agencies, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, and NSIRA, and the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, NSICOP. Both organizations have access to all of the specific classified details of our operations, and are looking at our ability to make sure that we not only respect the law, but our procedures. And NSICOP in the last couple of years has indeed looked at how the security intelligence community was engaging with communities, and how we were making efforts to be a much more diverse and inclusive organizations.
Okay, thank you so much for your time today. Those are all of our questions.
Okay, thank you. Next, call on the Ottawa Police Service.
We have no questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Counsel for former Chief Slowly.
Thank you, Commissioner. Rebecca Jones for former Chief Slowly. We have no questions.
The province of Saskatchewan, please.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Mike Morris. I'm counsel for the government of Saskatchewan. I'd like to start out by discussing CSIS's February 13th draft threat assessment. So I'm going to ask the registrar to pull up the document. It's TS-NSC CAN 001 50172. Mr. Vigneault, just as we're waiting, this document is entitled Possible Implications of Emergency Act Across the IMVE Space. I gather you're familiar with it. Is that fair?
Yes, I am familiar.
The clerk of the Privy Council mentioned last week that this document was available to attendees of the February 13th cabinet meeting. Do you recall it being distributed?
My recollection is that the document was discussed at earlier that day at the IRG meeting, and the document was made available to the Privy Council office, who is charged with cabinet materials, cabinet documentations. So I do not have personal knowledge if the document was distributed, but I am aware of the clerk's comments last week.
You attended the cabinet meeting on February 13th, correct?
I did.
I guess my question is, would you expect to have received notice from the clerk that this document was being made available or distributed for that meeting, if it was?
I was aware that we CSIS were asked to make the document available to PCO, so I knew that the intent was for the document to be distributed. I just do not have the personal knowledge if indeed it was, because the meeting was obviously scheduled, fairly quickly that Sunday evening.
Right. Would all attendees at Cabinet have had the security clearance necessary to view this document?
They will all have the right to see it. Ministers do not have security clearances. As privy councillors, they are deemed to be to have access to the classified information. So yes, they would. Every member of a cabinet would have been entitled to see that information.
Okay. To the best of your recollection, was the content of this document related fully and accurately at the cabinet meeting?
I do not remember the document being discussed specifically.
Okay. I'm going to quote you a statement that the clerk of the Privy Council made in her evidence on Friday. So I want you to just listen closely. If we need to pull up the transcript, we can. The clerk stated, Cabinet was aware that CSIS had not assessed a threat to the security of Canada necessary to trigger their authorities under the CSIS Act. Are you able to agree with that statement?
Yes, I'm able to agree because I had been part of previous meetings. My colleague, Madame Tessier, has also been part of meetings when we were providing that assessment to Cabinet. So it had been provided, a few times. And as we testified to earlier, this was a dynamic assessment. So it's not because we came to that position earlier that we would not change. It was when it was reiterated to Cabinet, it was the assessment of the day that continued to be the same thing. So I'm very comfortable to say that Cabinet was aware of this assessment.
Okay, thank you, sir. I want to move on to discuss the ability of the federal government to sort of disclose CSIS's bottom line assessment to provincial governments and premiers in particular, because we're aware that there was a first ministers meeting on the morning of February 14th. And I'm interested in whether CSIS's bottom line conclusions would have been able to be disclosed at that meeting. And I want to put two of those bottom line conclusions to you, sir. One is that CSIS's assessment that the protests did not pose a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. Would the federal government have been at liberty to disclose that information on February 14th at the first ministers meeting?
I would say that probably not, because the CSIS Act under Section 19 is fairly restrictive in terms of who can access classified information. And so that access does not go to provinces, territories, or municipalities. So that would be my, I was not part of the specific meeting, but for the purpose of this discussion, that would be my reaction. Section 19 will not allow the classified information to be shared.
Well, if there was information of a threat, for example, in the province of Saskatchewan, how would that information then be conveyed to the provincial government? Somebody must have the authority to release it. Is that fair?
So the way that information, threat information, operational information is relayed is through between CSIS and law enforcement bodies in this context. It would be RCMP. We referred earlier to construct called Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams that exist across the country that allow different levels of law enforcement to receive the information. So that's normally how the classified threat information will be relayed.
Okay. I just have a couple more questions. We heard some evidence the other day that the NSIA asked the RCMP to produce a threat assessment for the use of the clerk of the Privy Council on February 14th. I'm wondering, was CSIS asked to prepare a similar threat assessment for the clerk of the Privy Council on February 14th?
I do not recall such a request. I have seen the testimony, and as part of the preparation for this appearance, I've seen an exchange of email that was in reference to that threat assessment. I do not recall that day being asked specifically to do such an assessment.
Okay, I just have one final question. This one's more of sort of personal interest, and it's to Ms. Tessier. Ms. Tessier, you've had a lengthy career with CSIS, and I understand that you would have been employed with CSIS following the September 11th attacks. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
We've heard that CSIS's threat assessment remained at medium throughout the Freedom Convoy. Can you advise whether CSIS's threat assessment exceeded medium in the period immediately following the September 11th attacks?
I'm going to have to refer, because the national threat assessment level is assessed by ITAC, so I'll refer that question to my ITAC colleague.
Thank you. It would be very difficult to say. The ITAC was created in following a 2004 policy, a national security policy, so it was not in existence right after the September 11 attacks.
Maybe if I could add to that, Council, Commissioner, I would say that to my knowledge, the first time that the National Terrorism Threat Assessment was created was in 2014, and so to the best of my knowledge, it did not exist in the aftermath of 9/11.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions.
Okay, thank you. Next is the Government of Canada, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert McKinnon for the Government of Canada. I just want to clarify first the document that my friend put to you just a moment ago. It's actually an attachment to the cabinet minutes in a different document ID. If you want to pull it up, you can see it SSM NSC.can, number of zeros 216, page 12. Is that the assessment that my friend just put to you?
Yes, it looks to be it, yes.
And if you scroll up a little bit, you'll see it's part of the minutes from cabinet meeting. So that would have been distributed as part of the cabinet. Is that right?
Yes, it appears so.
All right. On another question that Mr. Miller put to you a question suggesting that it was only on or after January 25 that there were concerns about threats and extreme ideologies in connection with the convoy. Do you recall that?
Yes.
You have also testified that CSIS was receiving the OPP's Project Hendon reports and participated in the Joint Intelligence Group in relation to the convoy. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'd ask that you pull up the document OPP 401606. This is a Project Hendon report dated January 23rd. And if you go to the second page, okay, stop. If you look at the paragraph that starts the third, we assess the commercial truck drivers participating in the Freedom Convoy are likely to be generally supportive of holding a lawful protest. However, convoy supporters may include individuals representing ideological movements who may view the protest as an opportunity to advance their own causes or beliefs. Some of these individuals may engage in activities that are not sanctioned.
Can you just slow down a bit, please, in your reading?
Sure. That are not sanctioned or supported by convoy organizers in order to achieve their own objectives. The post on the Rise Up Durham website referencing Ottawa being wild, which echoes the language used by former U.S. President Donald Trump prior to the 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, tends to support this hypothesis. If accurate, then this assessment could indicate the possibility for conflict between a larger group comprising commercial truck drivers and a smaller group of ideologically driven opportunists. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you would have received, or CSIS would have received in their regional offices and agencies this Hendon report of January 23rd. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
I'd also ask you to pull up OPP 0001608. It's another Hendon report dated January 24th. And just the first bullet point, if you can go up a little bit, yes. You'll see it says, Diagolon content has been posted or pinned on some social media sites promoting the Freedom Convoy. Some Diagolon adherents are indicating an intent to attend the event in Ottawa. We have not yet identified any comments from convoy organizers disassociating the convoy from Diagolon. Diagolon flags were also observed at a pro-convoy rally in Sudbury on January 22nd. And then if you go over the page to just above tactical considerations, the range of anti-authority movements supporting the convoy, the presence of Diagolon insignia on convoy social media sites and at the Sudbury protest, and the potential attendance of supporters from the line at the protest in Ottawa validate previous assessments that noted the use of the Freedom Convoy by actors who may be willing to engage in acts of public disorder and possibly violence. Do you see that?
Yes.
And that information, again, would have been received by the CSIS regional offices and all recipients of the Hendon reports on January 24th. Is that correct?
I would have to assume so.
And the last one, document I'll take you to ts.nsc.can.001. Then a number of zeros, 156. This is an ITAC threat assessment of the possibility of IMVE-driven violence on the margins of the truck convoy protest. So this one's dated January 26th, before the January 27th date in the email that my friend took you to. So if you look at the second paragraph, while this is intended by the organizers to be a peaceful protest, open source reporting indicates that prominent ideologically motivated violent extremism actors in Canada have seized upon this protest to advocate for their own ideological objectives, and some have expressed interest in attending the protest in Ottawa this coming weekend. So again, this would have been received by CSIS's regional offices and well, it's created from ITAC itself. So and that, well, you can speak to that, Ms. Shayer. Is that correct?
Yes, we published that document on January 26th, and it was distributed to our ADM and SOPS colleagues, so the broader National Security Committee in the federal government. And the next day, we published an unclassified version, which was made available to our security colleagues in other jurisdictions.
So all these reports, would they not indicate a concern about violent extremist elements attending or being part of this convoy?
So our assessment pointed to a number of possible scenarios. We talked about the possibility of INVE voices, if you will, leveraging the event to push their own narrative, their own violent narratives, and potentially recruit and incite violence. We also talked about the possibility of this event and a very, very present narrative of some IMV-inspired people, which could potentially trigger vulnerable individuals to mobilize quickly to violence and then conduct an act of terrorism.
Okay, I don't need that document anymore. This one's for Mr. Vigneault. You were asked a question earlier today, and it's also, you gave an answer that's also in your summary of the in-camera testimony when about your support for the invocation of this act, the Emergencies Act. And you said, based on your understanding of everything you had seen up until that point, do you recall that?
Yes.
Can you detail what you had seen or been informed of that contributed to your opinion that it was necessary to invoke the Emergencies Act?
Essentially, our information that we've testified to is an evidence with the fact that we knew there were ideologically motivated violent individuals who were interested in this event. The unpredictable nature of this event, the fact that it had gone through different phases and its size and scope continued to be, both in Ottawa and across the country, continue to vary. Spontaneous and not so spontaneous events, blockades, and so on. Fact that law enforcement resources were being diverted from different sites to potentially deliberately to make sure that there were less capacity to deal with these events. Fact that we, as part of the many interdepartmental meetings I attended, information from the CBSA, from Transport Canada, from Finance Canada, about the impact that the disruption, the protest, the blockades were taking the country. And the fact that there was an evolving operational plan by law enforcement that at that point had not yet been put in place to be able to deal with this situation. All of these elements of unpredictability, based on my experience, having been around national security issues for quite a few years now, led me to believe that the regular tools were just not enough to address the situation.
Okay, here's another question concerning the decision. Did the GIC have the same inputs that CSIS had when it made its decision and CSIS made its decision under its act? Are you aware whether they were exactly the same inputs?
I did not have full access to, necessarily the documents that the GIC was presented. What I can say is that I had been part of personally, or my colleague, Madame Tessier, had been part of the cabinet discussions, the IRGs. So I had I would say a very good understanding, but I could not characterize it as being perfect information necessarily.
Right. I'll take you to briefly the summary of the in-camera proceeding that a couple of council have taken you to, just to look at a couple other paragraphs. So if you could pull up WTS 6079, page 4. So where it says in the paragraph, Ms. Tessier explained, that's right, that unlike RMVE, IMVE groups often do not have a command and control structure or organized membership. Now, we've heard that said today. Could you you mentioned networks, but perhaps one or other of you could just explain just quickly the difference.
Yeah, certainly. As I mentioned earlier today in my testimony, in the past, and I use Al-Qaeda as an example, there was very much an organized structure. Not anybody could adhere to Al-Qaeda. Whereas today, especially given the internet and the ability to network together on social media, there is difficulty in just comparing it to what would have been the case in the past, where you had a physical presence, you had to be vetted to be part of this group. Not to say that there are some IMVE groups that don't do that, most certainly there are, But given the vastness of communications today, especially on the internet and various social media sites, the ability to get to know individuals who share your extreme ideology is a lot easier than it would have been in the past. And so it's these, that's why we prefer to call them networks. And we referred to lone wolves earlier, how one person can commit an act. They don't necessarily have to be directed to do so. They weren't necessarily vetted by anybody, but they adhere to this network. And that's just but one example in terms of what we see today.
If I could ask you to turn to page 8. Under threat assessment concerning invoking the Emergencies Act, if you could look at the paragraph that starts, Ms. Tessier explained that there was an initial increase in online rhetoric after the invocation, but because it was announced at the same time as public health measures being lowered, the increase petered out. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's our assessment, yes.
So it wasn't as aggravated as perhaps the assessment first foresaw? Is that?
I would say that's very specific to the Emergencies Act itself, but we have most certainly seen, as I testified to earlier, an increase in anti-authority rhetoric.
Okay. And because I may not have time to take you to some of these ITAC assessments that are referred to in the next paragraph, can you just confirm that the summary there is accurate, that it says the panel will refer to several CSIS and ITAC assessments between 2020 to the period the convoy ended, describing threats to journalists and politicians. The panel agreed that since 2020, there has been an increase in IMVE online rhetoric and threat to authority figures, including law enforcement, public and elected officials. Ms. Shire explained that this rhetoric was mostly targeted towards politicians, including as against provincial officials and the Prime Minister. You see that? Do you have any sort of further comment on that threat environment from 2020 to today? Has it changed in any way, or has it remained the same?
I would say it is increasing, and I'll pass to my colleague as well, but I would, from the CSIS perspective, part of the concern is you're seeing a lot of this type of discussion in more mainstream media. And we know through some of the individuals that we would be concerned with, and as I mentioned a number of times today, they try to use that to recruit individuals towards a more extreme ideology. So because we see a lot more of this globally, frankly, adherence to this type of a movement, it is of increasing concern in terms of the ability for people to access that type of violent propaganda. I don't know if my colleague...
I completely agree. I would also add that we have seen during the pandemic, especially while people were staying home, they spent a whole lot of time on social media, on the internet, and there's surveys that have been done that show a large increase in the number of people researching internet sites that have IMVE content. So we have seen that trend. We have seen also the number, as is written in this summary, the number of threats targeting public officials, politicians have been increasing also quite significantly.
And can online rhetoric translate into action in the real world?
Sometimes, but I think, as Ms. Tessier mentioned earlier today, one of the things that we're very concerned about is the people who actually consume that rhetoric, that see those threats and get maybe inspired to conduct acts of violence after having consumed all of those narratives. So when someone posts a threat against a politician, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person has the intent to carry out an attack or to target the person. But it can and it has inspired others to do so.
If I can be permitted to add concrete examples, we saw that the attacker in Christchurch, Brendan Tarrant, had written the name of, amongst others, Alexandre Bissonnette on his one of his weapons, and many others who obviously influenced by that activity. More recently, we saw the Buffalo shooter do the same thing and put the name of individuals who have committed these previous acts as well, writing that on their weapons. So you see the influence of these individuals who live stream these attacks and how other individuals go towards that type of content and then give them credit when they actually conduct the attack.
Is it difficult to predict the point at which online violent rhetoric translates into action, violence?
Absolutely, it's very difficult.
And you had mentioned, I'd heard the words dynamic and fluid and so forth. How would you describe that type of threat assessment? Is it done on a daily basis?
Yes, I believe I mentioned that earlier. We have to, and we did, continuously assess the situation, look if anybody was radicalizing because of the environment and because we knew that there were individuals trying to recruit people towards their more extreme violent movement.
Maybe if I could add one point to this is that we talked earlier about the very dynamic nature and evolving nature of the IMV environment. And because we are sitting at the same table with our law enforcement partners, we share a lot of information. And sometimes it will be information coming from a law enforcement source that will inform CSIS that we may need to look at it from a national security, threat to security of Canada point of view. And sometimes it's information we would have collected as part of our own investigations that we would share to law enforcement that there might be a credible threat of a criminal activity, including, as we discussed earlier, threat to politicians and so on, that would be the purview of law enforcement to investigate. And so that is a very dynamic exchange between law enforcement and intelligence, CSIS specifically.
All right. I have a question for Mr. Vigneault concerning questions that were put to you earlier. So you were asked a number of questions about the interpretation of the CSIS Act. And you're aware that the Government of Canada has received legal advice generally on the Emergencies Act. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you're aware that the Government of Canada has received legal advice generally on the Emergencies Act and has claimed solicitor and client privilege over that advice, are you not?
I'm aware.
And you have not been given authority to waive any solicitor and client privilege over that advice, is that correct?
That's correct.
And when you answered questions regarding the interpretation of various statutes, you were expressing your own understanding. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
All right. I have a document to pull up.
You're pretty well out of time, so you're going to have to wrap up.
All right. I don't know if one of my friends who gave up their 5 minutes would cede me that time, but if I see a nod, I feel like it's a bingo parlor.
I'll even cede him my 5 minutes.
I just think that I'm not going to get through what I want to, but I think some of this is important, I thought.
Okay, well, focus on...
Yes, I've got a document that I'm going to ask for your explanation of, Mr. Vigneault. It's ts.can.001, well, several zeros, 001, then several zeros, 1 again. So it's entitled Fabric of Society. It's a CSIS document. So it's ts.can.001 number of zeros, then 1.
In case it assists, there are 7 zeros before the 1, ts.can.
There we go. All right. Mr. Vigneault, could you explain what this represents and how CSIS utilizes this?
So again, we've done a lot of work inside the organization to better understand the dynamic of IMV, what's happening in society, what are some social movements that potentially have an impact on our CSIS mandate. And this, if you can maybe reduce the font. If you look at this, it has the shape of a funnel, and essentially what we try to do with this is to explain at the top of the funnel is that, a lot of personal grievances linked to Islamophobia, oppression of indigenous people, the fear of, conspiracy theories like QAnon, xenophobia, neo-Nazi influences. So there's a lot of things that, circulate in society. And that is essentially what is unfortunately very present on social media. When I referred to earlier as awful but lawful, we see a lot of that potentially extremely violent and vile information. But again, this is protected by charter. This is acceptable in a democracy. And the further down you go through the funnel, you're getting into areas that might be potentially constitute hate speech under the criminal code. And at the narrowest part of the funnel, this is where CSIS or analytical analysis describe this is where the narrowest part of the funnel where our 2C investigations would kick in. And so that is a conceptual analytical construct to help identify what is happening in society and where we versus the police versus other elements of the society should be concerned with. CSIS should be informed of what's happening on top of the funnel where it's lawful. We are informed by that information, but we're not investigating that. That is, lawful information. Where we are, as I said, is the narrowest part of the funnel. So one other element that is, I think, critical in all of this is we've said early on that people can radicalize extremely quickly. Or mobilize to violence very quickly. So we've seen people, move from being consumer, as my colleague said, consumer of those narratives, to go down and very quickly to say, I need to do something about it. I will mobilize, I will engage, I will train, I will acquire weapon, and I will commit violence. And so this is our attempt to depict what is happening in society and where the CSIS mandate fits.
Last question. Was there a concern by CSIS concerning this convoy that others who have been radicalized in some form and were engaging in online rhetoric would use the convoy as a vehicle to recruit?
Indeed, I think it was. I don't think it was our assessment at CSIS, and ITAC came to the same conclusion. Where we are seeing, unfortunately, in the past, people exploiting those types of events for their own purposes, and other people who, again, very quickly are mobilizing to violence based on information, based on motivation to use such an event to engage in acts of violence.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any re-examination?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Two brief points of clarification, I hope. Though I see my friend, Mr. McKinnon, rewrote the summary himself while delivering it to the witness, so it might be that it's had the salutary effect that we need here. I think this question is for you, Mr. Vigneault, and I'd ask that the summary of the closed session, which is WTS 079, be brought up, and if we could go to the top of page 9, maybe the bottom of page 8 and the top of page 9. Thank you, and this passage has had some discussion a fair bit already today, so I won't repeat the whole thing. But Mr. Vigneault, I think what some people have expressed some puzzlement about is just the way you phrased it, and that if I tried to say something in French, you would have to cover your ears. So I'm not faulting your English here. It's just that sometimes we see Francophones express things this way, and I want to see if I can offer you an alternative expression in English, or if you'd prefer, just ask you to say it in French. The way you phrased the last 8 or 10 words there allows for two meanings in English that I think you intended only one of them. So it says, he advised the Prime Minister of his belief that it was indeed required to invoke the Act. Okay? And some people are wondering if it has any meaning other than an article that is reflexive to invoke the Act. So one way of rewording that might be advised the Prime Minister of his belief that the invocation of the Act was required, or it was, as Mr. McKinnon put it, necessary to invoke the Act. Do either of those sound right to you? And if they don't, please just say it in French, and you'll lose me, but the Commissioner will be right on it.
I think to be clearer than maybe the summary is, and of course it was not a verbatim record of what was said, it was a summary. I think if I pick up on top of page 9, opinion of everything he had seen to that point, he advised the Prime Minister of his belief that the situation indeed required to invoke the Act. I think that would be a fair assessment of what I wanted to say.
Okay, I'm going to tell you that leaves us with the same ambiguity. So, do you want to try it in French?
I'm not sure that I can be clearer than that. And if you want to put to me, you know, the two interpretation, you know, again,
I'll try it again. Would you think it sounded right if you said he advised the Prime Minister of his belief that it was indeed necessary to invoke the Act?
I think that would be in my head. It means the same thing. So necessary would be absolutely fine.
Then we're there. Thank you.
Okay.
And then on another point of clarification, probably this one for you, Ms. Tessier. Not everybody followed the graphic about IMVE the way the graphic designer probably hoped everyone would follow it, which is quickly and easily. And we were going to try to walk you through that when we realized you've actually got it written out in words in your institutional report. So if you could, Mr. Clerk, if you could call up DOJ IR 701 and take us to page 7, about 2/3 of the way down. And Ms. Tessier, if this is a question for you, I'll ask you to look at the verbal description of the placemat, which is there. And in particular, if you can confirm that that's an accurate description of what the placemat is trying to say, with us being especially interested in the paragraph afterwards, if an actor only demonstrates, which the words for us seem much clearer than the placemat was able to describe. So if you can confirm that those words are accurate, that'll resolve that for us.
Yes, they are accurate.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Okay, so that ends your testimony. Thank you very much for coming and testifying at the commission. Much appreciated, and you're free to go. We're going to move on to the next. So I'm going to do a 5-minute break just to change the arrangements, maybe 10 minutes to change the arrangements and move to our next witness. So a 10-minute break.
The commission is in recess for 10 minutes. La commission est levée pour 10 minutes. Order à l'autre. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay. Now, just before we start, if I could I just want to make a brief statement that from now on for the balance of the week, we will be hearing from a number of senior government ministers, including the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. The Commission recognizes that this is exceptional, and even more so as the House, as I understand it, is sitting. So the latter fact, the fact the House is sitting, is such that it may require some accommodation for these witnesses in the event of votes, the House of Commons, or events requiring that they respond to pressing needs. So I just wanted to put that on the record. So for parties, it's also important that in the course of these examinations, we not lose sight of the reason that they are here to testify. That is the subject matter of this inquiry. The examinations, therefore, must remain focused on this, particularly in light of the limited time we have. Finally, as I have insisted throughout, I will continue to insist that the conduct of the public and indeed the parties be respectful at all times, which I'm sure everyone understands. So I just wanted to say that because we're sort of entering another phase for the balance. Okay, so with that introduction, Commission Counsel.
Thank you, Commissioner. Gordon Cameron for Commission Counsel, and the first witness in this category of ministers is Minister Bill Blair. If you could take the stand and he will be sworn.
Minister Blair, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
On a Bible, please.
For the record, please state your full name and spell it out.
My name is William Blair, B-L-A-I-R.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
So help me God. I
Thank
swear.
you.
Sir.
Good afternoon, Minister Blair. I'll begin just with some housekeeping, some formalities, and in particular, what I'm going to ask you to do is recall that you had an interview with me and some of my colleagues on September 6th. And for the record, I'll note for parties that the summary of that interview is WTS 7048. Now, Minister Blair, have you had a chance to review this witness summary that was prepared following your interview?
Yes, sir, I have.
And can you confirm that it's accurate and that you adopted it as part of your evidence before this proceeding?
I can confirm that, yes.
Thank you. Now, if we can just go through a little bit of background for those who aren't already familiar with your role in the federal government recently and before that. You were the Minister of Public Safety from November 2019 to October 2021, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And in October of 2021, you were appointed, and this is a long title, and it requires a bit of updating. You were appointed as President of the Queen's Privy Council. Now you will be the President of the King's Privy Council, I take it, and also as the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in the Prime Minister's mandate letters, that is the letters that the Prime Minister writes for each of his ministers to describe what he expects from them during their tenure, the Prime Minister assigned leadership responsibilities regarding public safety and emergency preparedness, both to you, Minister Blair, and to Minister Mendicino. And so the question is, can you help us understand how that division works under the umbrella of the Ministry of Emergency Preparedness and Public Safety?
Yes, sir. As you noted earlier, I previously held the position of Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Quite frankly, the government recognized in the most recent past a significant increase in both the severity, complexity, and frequency of national emergencies taking place in this country. And so a decision was made to bifurcate my previous ministry into the public safety, which is a portfolio held by my colleague and friend, Minister Mendicino, and Minister of Emergency Preparedness, which is the portfolio that I am responsible for. Under that, I think there's a very clear delineation of responsibilities, but there's a very close alignment between the work that I do and that Minister Mendicino does. Mr. Mendicino is, for example, responsible under the Act for 5 different, significant agencies in the federal government, including the RCMP, CBSA, CSIS, Corrections Canada, and the Parole Board. And he also has a number of other significant responsibilities within his own mandate. For myself, my responsibilities particularly pertain to ensuring that the Government of Canada is prepared to respond effectively to all hazards and emergencies in this country, to improve the way in which the government prepares and also creates greater resiliency in the country about these events. Among the administrative processes I am also responsible for is I oversee requests for assistance that are received from the provinces and territories for assistance in the advent of an emergency.
If you could try and be a little slower for the interpreters, because they have to translate everything you say, and you have a tendency to have a high output.
Yes, sir. I'll certainly do my very best.
Okay.
And I would appreciate the occasional reminder that I think Mr. Cameron's quite prepared to provide.
The scribes at the interview got lost after a few minutes of the interview. Now, if that's a helpful description, Minister Blair, of the division between the two parts of public safety and emergency preparedness. Here's something that's more challenging for all of us, is if you can describe for us your role as President of the King's Privy Council and how that, what role you play there. I'll remind you, just as a place to start, that among other things you chair the SSE committee, the Safety, Security and Emergencies Committee, but writ large, can you describe that office and what responsibilities come with it?
There are within federal legislation certain federal agencies, such as the Transportation Safety Board, that answers directly to the president of now the King's Privy Council. But it also is important to recognize the close collaboration that exists between my responsibilities as the president of King's Privy Council and the work of the Privy Council office within the federal government. It requires, in addition to my responsibilities in chairing, for example, the SSE committee, the Safety, Security and Emergency Committee, a very close collaboration with the Privy Council office. I have, for example, within PCO, a deputy secretary, Ms. Bogdan, who I believe you've heard from, who I work very closely with on matters of emergency preparedness, and with respect to other cabinet-related issues, I work very closely with the deputy clerk, Ms. Drouin, as well.
Right. And something we'll come back to in a little bit of detail a little later in this examination. One of the functions of your office includes handling requests for assistance, what we've now learned to call RFAs, where somebody from level of government lower than the federal government asks for the assistance of the federal government in some particular sphere. Can you tell us, just broadly speaking, how that works? As we'll come to the one specific to the convoy in a minute, but just broadly how that process works.
Yes, sir. There is a provision within our government for provinces and territories to make requests of our government for assistance for certain types of emergencies. The criteria is reasonably well established. In the past 2 years, I've been responsible for, well, since the beginning of the pandemic, I've actually managed about 200 requests for assistance that the government has received from our provincial and territorial partners. These can take a number of different forms. There were quite a number of them related to the pandemic in particular, but also in the advent of floods and fires, the hurricanes that recently took place in Atlantic Canada, all can result when events exceed the capacity of the provinces and territories to manage it. The RFA process allows them to reach out for assistance, and whatever we're able to provide, it is my responsibility to arrange that. Much of that work is done with other federal departments, public safety, the Department of National Defense, and others. But to ensure that whatever federal supports can be provided to the provinces and territories, we do that as expeditiously as possible.
And can you describe to me the level of formality that process follows? And it's probably not the same in every case, but sometimes it's a phone call, perhaps followed up later by writing, sometimes writing followed up later by a phone call. But can you describe for the Commissioner just how the process tends to take place in the example of a typical flood or hurricane?
In my experience, sir, and as I said, we've done now a couple of hundred of these, senior officials usually begin talking very quickly, even in anticipation of an emergency. For example, if we know a hurricane is coming, or at the beginning of the wildfire season. Communications begin to take place between senior officials in both either the province or territory and our federal departments, whichever is implicated. Most of that is managed through the Ministry of Public Safety. And for example, in my experience, most of that work has been done by Deputy Stewart, who I think you've also heard from. There's usually discussions that take place between senior officials. There's also a table of senior officials, sometimes referred to as the senior officials responsible for emergency management, SORM, who also engage in these types of discussions. That's usually followed up very quickly by a formal letter of request from the province or territory that is directed to the Ministry of Public Safety and then on to me for a determination. But we try to work as quickly as possible in order to see if we can, whatever helps we can provide in response to those requests. And then through, again, Deputy Stewart, a response to that request is prepared, to which I'm able to then hopefully quickly respond.
So if the hurricane's coming up the coast, you don't wait till the letter arrives before you start mobilizing a response to a request for
No,
assistance?
and in fact, in our most recent experience with Hurricane Fiona, as it was moving to Atlantic Canada, we were receiving very good forecasting from Environment Canada, which gave us a pretty good idea of where that hurricane was going to land. And so there were conversations that began days in advance so that we could be better prepared and mobilize and even stage resources in order to respond to what we knew was going to be a significant impact on those regions of the country, and that we would be able to work closely together as quickly as possible. There are a number of other programs as well. And for example, I'm also responsible for what we refer to as the humanitarian workforce, where we work very closely with NGOs such as the Canadian Red Cross and stage those resources and begin to register people well in advance of the hurricane in that case, so that we can respond as quickly as possible in real time to help people be safe.
And I assume that if you do act immediately before the paperwork arrives, there will nonetheless be the requirement for the orderly administration and documentation of the RFA that the paperwork eventually come through and then the request be properly documented.
Yes, sir. Those requests are properly documented, but we don't necessarily wait for the paperwork. Sometimes there have been very limited circumstances where the paperwork arrived first, and then we start responding to that immediately. But in the vast majority of cases, there's outreach from the province and territory who identify a situation that exceeds their capacity, where they seek our help, and then we undertake immediately to see if we can find that help within the federal government.
Thank you. Now, if you can describe perhaps, well, certainly atypically relative to most other government departments, you are lodged, so to speak, in the Privy Council office and supported by people also in the Privy Council office. And one of the people also there is the National Security Intelligence Advisor, Jody Thomas. If you could describe for us how you, as Minister of Emergency Preparedness, work with or relate with, interact with the National Security Intelligence Advisor.
Yes, the National Security Intelligence Advisor is actually a very important source of guidance, advice, and information for our preparation in order to respond appropriately to emergencies. In a number of different capacities, including that I chair the Safety, Security, and Emergency Committee, but even in our daily and weekly interactions, the National Security Intelligence Advisor is a person who gathers information from the National Security Intelligence Establishment, from law enforcement, and from other sources, and provides it to government, including to me, to assist us in making sure that we're able to do our duties in a timely way and be well informed of what government needs to know in order to keep people safe.
Thank you. Now, we've had, as you probably know, already testifying among the senior government officials who testified last week, Jacqueline Bogdan and Jeff Hutchinson. Maybe you could just remind us, now that you're here, where they fit in the scheme of your Department of Emergency Preparedness.
Yes, sir. When the government decided, when the Prime Minister decided, that to place a special emphasis and create a unique ministry dealing with emergency preparedness, we recognized that in order to make that work, we also had to fundamentally change the way in which the public service, through the Privy Council office, organizes itself in response to preparation for emergency. And so there was decisions made within PCO by the clerk in order to create some additional positions within the Privy Council office to essentially create an office to more formalize and, I think, to make more effective the government's response to emergencies and in our preparation in a wide variety, a very significant spectrum of activities, including increased resilience, investment in critical infrastructure, and an all hazards approach. And it was also, I think, very important to make connections. One of the things I have found in my responsibility, sir, and working with PCO, that emergencies are not uniquely located within any one ministry or department. That is, they very often implicate like a whole of government. We learned that certainly in the floods, for example, in British Columbia, where, initially when I went to British Columbia with the Prime Minister to meet with the provincial government, we looked at it as an emergency response to a flood, but very quickly learned that agriculture, transportation, fisheries and oceans, natural resources, Environment Canada, all of these different departments of government were deeply implicated in that emergency. And so one of my responsibilities working with PCO and Ms. Bogdan is in a convening role to bring all of the departments together and bring senior officials to make sure that all of government is responding appropriately as necessary to every emergency. And so a decision was made. Ms. Bogdan was brought in as the Deputy Secretary responsible for emergency management, and she also has responsibility for the COVID response of the government. She's also overseeing that. And Mr. Hutchison was also brought in and serves in a number of different roles, including he is Secretary to the Cabinet Committee that I chair, the Safety, Security, and Emergencies Committee. He's also acted as Secretary in other duties that I've been assigned by the Prime Minister. And for example, I co-chaired with British Columbia a committee with the British Columbia government involving all of the ministers and very significant representation from First Nations leadership. In coordinating all of government's response to the floods, and Jeff acted as the secretary for that committee as well.
Okay, and a third name that we're going to encounter in some of the documents, and that those who have been following will have seen already, Zita Astravis. Can you describe what her role is in your department?
Yes, Zita is the Chief of Staff for my ministry office. I have within my ministry office people who are responsible for policy development as it pertains to emergencies, with communications and media relations, and finally with operations, because we engage with every region of the country. And all of the people that work in that office are overseen by my chief of staff, Zita Estravis. She is a very serious and experienced political staffer within a ministry office, and she previously served as my chief of staff when I was the Minister of Public Safety.
Now, again, people who've been following this proceeding or following the original events will know that there's another part of your background that ended up assuming special significance as these events unfolded in January and February, and that was your first career as a police officer and ultimately the chief of police of the Toronto Police Service. First of all, can you describe in broad strokes what that experience was, and then I'll bring you back to the particular public order experience that you had in those roles.
Yes, Mr. Cameron. I joined the Toronto Police Service in 1976. I served as a Toronto police officer for 39 years, and for the last 10 years of my 39-year career, from 2005 until 2015, I was the chief of police of the city of Toronto. And in that capacity, I served in a number of roles and that were somewhat related to the events that transpired.
Right. Now, as I understand it, as you were coming up the ranks, you in fact served a term as an inspector of a public order unit itself, that is the actual unit that goes out and deals with public order incidents, is that right?
Yes, sir. I was public order trained, and I served as a public order incident commander for very, very many public order incidents in the city of Toronto over a number of years.
Okay. Now, the one that often gets remembered because it was so newsworthy was the G20 event in Toronto, which ended up being a public order event as well as its political event on its own. And you played a role in that, but it would probably be helpful if you described what role you played, what role you didn't play, and roughly how that, what you learned from that experience.
Yes, sir. The G20, it occurred in June of 2010 in the city of Toronto. It was a planned event. I was, throughout that entire period of time, the chief of police, and therefore responsible for policing in my city. But the event itself was actually headed up by an integrated command structure with a gold, silver, bronze command structure that was put in place, the leadership of which was with the RCMP, but also it had representatives from my service, but also from some of the regional services around and the OPP. And they were actually responsible for the operational response to the G20. But throughout that period, I was the chief of police and therefore ultimately responsible for every policing-related matter taking place in my city.
Right. And as you mentioned, probably in a 30-odd year career, and especially 10 as chief of police, there were more than just the G20 event. And the one other perhaps event or series of events that was memorable during that period when you were chief of police were the Tamil protests in Toronto. And I mention them because you might find some similarities with some of the events that happened around Ottawa. And if you could just tell us about those events and how they were resolved, at least as best as you can recollect it.
Yes, sir. That took place in May of 2009. It was a period in which there was a great deal of concern within the Tamil community, and there's a very substantial Tamil community in the Greater Toronto Area, about events that were taking place in Sri Lanka at that particular time. And as a consequence, a number of people came out onto the streets to begin to protest. There were two, frankly, significant and somewhat distinct matters that I had to deal with as the chief of police during that event. On Mother's Day of 2009, about 5,000 people from the Tamil community were demonstrating and marching, and unfortunately went up on a ramp of the Gardiner Expressway and ended up on the elevated highway that runs through downtown Toronto. I was called because, of course, they had blocked the highway. It wasn't a particularly serious traffic issue because it was Mother's Day, a Sunday evening, and not too concerning. But I heard from my operational commanders that evening that there were no safe ways to remove those people from the bridge. There was a real concern because the guardrail really is for vehicles, not for pedestrians. There were children and elderly people up on that elevated highway, and there was a very sincere concern among my officers that any action that we might take to remove them from the bridge or even bring them down the ramp could result in a stampede, a crushing of people, and would just be simply too dangerous. And so I directed that we would slow down, that we would engage with the people that were on the bridge. We would find people that we could talk to on the bridge, and that took a couple of hours. And then eventually I engaged them in some conversation. I had a pretty good relationship with that community and found a way to have them safely come down off that bridge. And it was, in my opinion, an entirely appropriate and safe resolution of what could have potentially been a very dangerous situation. The other element to this is tens of thousands of people initially converged on University Avenue in the area of University and Armory, which is right near the 361, our Superior Courts in Toronto, but also right opposite the U.S. Consulate. And initially when they went there, it was considered quite disruptive. It was noisy and it was interfering with traffic, but very quickly we were able to work with that crowd to allow the TTC, for example, to operate on both Queen and Dundas so that the transit would continue to move. Those are pretty important transit routes in the city. We also were concerned about access and egress for our hospitals on Hospital Row on University Avenue. We worked out with them a way in which we could do that. And although that protest went on for several days, and there were concerns actually being expressed by the time I remember hearing from Superior Court judges about the noise outside their courtrooms. But at the same time, there was very little residential in that area. I would also want to acknowledge the people that were protesting did so in a very respectful way. They cleaned up after themselves. They were on the street. They were very seriously concerned. But I think that was a situation that in Toronto we were able to resolve appropriately and safely. And eventually, I think it actually strengthened our relationship very much with that community.
And if I recollect accounts of those events, one of the things you were able to accomplish with that demonstration was to move it from an arguably illegal demonstration in the sense that it was blocking University Avenue to a location nearby where the demonstration could continue but not be obstructing traffic and potentially breaking the law.
Yes, sir. And actually, that was based on some experience that we'd had in that particular area as well. I also remember in the late 90s, there was very significant demonstrations among two other communities, Serbian and Croatian, at that same location. And we worked very closely with those protesters to allow them to engage in their lawful peaceful protests, but do it in a way that minimized the disruption to traffic, to the movement of people, and to the functioning of basically the city's daily life all around them.
And as an incident commander or public order senior police officer, how do you factor in that particular attempted transition? That is, you encounter a public order incident. Ideally, you're able to keep it legal from beginning to end. But when it starts to transition into illegality, either because it's obstructing traffic or violating some other law, where in your ranking of objectives do you put turning what has become an unlawful protest into a lawful protest?
I think it's important. Frankly, I actually very sincerely believe in the right to lawful, peaceful protest. It's a protected charter right in this country. Sometimes it can be a challenge. It can be very difficult to manage these events. But I think if the protesters are willing to work with the police and if the police work with them, there are always some individuals who will push the limit and sometimes will break the law, and there are ways to deal with those individuals. But in my experience, it is always preferable if you're able to minimize the impact and to facilitate lawful, peaceful protest while not allowing unlawful protest or risk to public safety.
And you might not have monitored this part of the evidence, but we had a similar discussion with Deputy Commissioner Zablocki of the RCMP about this attempt that the RCMP took in and near Coutts, Alberta, to find a legal way for the protest to continue. And let me ask you if you found in those days when you were doing this the same tension, because the protesters want to be visible, they want to, in effect, cause at least enough of a nuisance that they're noticed and that they're able to make their point and be heard, and yet you want them to be as little a nuisance as possible. And is that a tension that your forces and the people you have as your liaison team are trained to try and sort out?
Well, if I may, just let me cite as an example. During the G20, we designated certain places where we wanted to facilitate lawful, peaceful protest. And for example, over at Queen's Park, we said, if you gather there, you'll be able to protest. And some people were quite willing to do that, but unfortunately not everybody is. And then some people, prefer to be, to disrupt traffic, or in the case of the G20, unfortunately, it also resulted in a set of circumstances where there was significant property damage, fires were set, and windows were smashed. But I think it's important to distinguish. There are always people who seek only to engage in lawful, peaceful protest. And I think it's our responsibility, and I say our, you'll forgive me, it's the police responsibility to facilitate that to every extent possible. And unfortunately, there are also, in some circumstances, people who choose to engage in unlawful behavior and don't engage in lawful but rather unlawful protest. And then there has to be whatever action is required in order to curtail that.
Right. Now, coming to the events in question, as the matters were developing, there was a series of what end up getting called briefings on truckers' convoy among ministers and senior officials in the government. And it looks from our account of the documentation that you attended probably all of them, or almost all of them. Is that your recollection?
I believe almost all of them, yes.
Yes. There was one on January 28th, and I'm going to ask the clerk to call up SSM NSC CAN 50251. And if you could, Mr. Kruger, if you can just scroll down, there's a point where we have a number 18, and Blair, there we go. And this is the notes of that, the readout, as it's called, of that meeting. And do I understand the way this is laid out correctly, that beside the number 18 in your name are a series of points that you were making at the meeting?
Yes, sir.
The one I'm going to ask you to talk about is C. We need to keep the language down. And probably the people in the room knew what you were talking about, and you probably used more words than just that. So if you could flesh that out for us, what message you were trying to get across during that briefing when you said we need to keep the language down?
I believe we all have a responsibility to do what is necessary to keep the peace. And I was concerned that inflammatory language could incite a more violent response, potentially, or incite others to continue to come to the protest. And so I think one needs to maintain, and I've had some experience in this, in your language around an event, to speak of it in such a way as to not aggravate it.
So minimize name calling and that kind of thing.
I don't normally engage in name calling, sir.
Right. But is that what you mean by keep the language down? Keep the rhetoric moderate on the government side, on the protester side?
I believe in my experience, sometimes people live down to your expectations, and so one should be careful in how you speak of these events. I also, quite frankly, I'm always concerned about fear. I think fear is one of the greatest enemies of public safety. And I think if our language is intemperate, we can make people quite fearful. And if people are fearful, then they don't use public space, they don't engage with their neighbors. It can actually create a more dangerous situation. And so my advice to colleagues was that we would remain tempered in our language.
I'd like to move now to another topic area that it's apparent that you took a role in, and that has to do with the arrangement of what were called, perhaps it was ended up being a misnomer, but what were originally called the tripartite meetings. Can you describe, first of all, what those were meant to be, to situate them in time, if it assists you? They were February 7th, 8th, and 10th, the ones that started it off. But if you can just tell us what you had hoped to accomplish with those meetings.
Yes, sir. It was my intention to convene all three orders of government, to bring them to a table, because I believe that all three orders of government had a role and responsibility here. I believe that good communication between all three orders of government could have been facilitated by convening, a meeting among. Initially, it was attempted to do so at the political level, and as you said, it wasn't entirely successful. But I believe what we were able to achieve is convening officials to come to that table, because I believe that the events that were transpiring in Ottawa really did require good communication, clear and clear expectations and communications and how we could assist each other. All of us had a responsibility, all of us had a role to play, and I was attempting to convene that. And by the way, not inconsistent with the role that I also play, as I mentioned earlier, in convening other orders of ministries within my own government. I've learned the value of bringing people together from many different disciplines and authorities to be at the table to share perspectives and to help each other.
Hey, there's two topics I'd like to see if we can talk about, and I'll see if we can do it without pulling up too many documents. But just going by your memories of these meetings, and I'll just describe the topics, and then we'll try to treat them one at a time, though they might end up getting blended together. One is the fact that you didn't succeed in getting Ontario at the political level to the table, as I think had been your ambition. But the other topic is why there seemed, in at least the records of these meetings, so much confusion or misunderstanding between the City of Ottawa and the federal government, and to the extent they were there, officials of the Ontario government, about which resources would be committed by whom, when, who was actually there, et cetera. The documents just seem to be the equivalent of a whole bunch of ships passing in the night, nobody understanding what the other person's saying, and perhaps even a lot of mistrust. So let's take the first of those issues, the effort you made to include the province of Ontario and how much success you had there.
Well, first of all, I reached out to Minister Jones, who was the Solicitor General in the province of Ontario at that time. I've enjoyed a very long-standing and very positive professional working relationship with Minister Jones. I reached out to extend an invitation for her to join that table. Minister Jones indicated to me during the one call I had with her that she would consider the invitation, but she did express some concern, and I understood that concern, and I acknowledged that to her. She expressed some concern that she did not want to be seen to be directing the police. And actually, we had a very brief exchange because I'm also very familiar, as she was, with the Linden Commission report on the Ipperwash event. And I think there is a natural sensitivity and concern among Ontario officials about any appearance of being seen to direct the police. I would also acknowledge Minister Mendicino, who has a direct reporting relationship. He is essentially Minister Jones' counterpart. He also had a number of conversations with her and with the Premier at the time. But in my one conversation with the Solicitor General, I sought to offer to make the invitation and to provide her with assurances about what my intent was in convening that table.
Mr. Clerk, perhaps you could call up SSM NSC CAN 402676 and just start at the top so we can orient ourselves with what this document is. That's got a nice helpful heading there, tripart meeting readout. And this is a February 10th meeting. And so, Mr. Clerk, if you could scroll down to about page 3. Thank you. There's just a little further, please, Mr. Clerk, so we get Minister Blair's comments there. And under BB, which is doubtless you, there's this notation. Thanks. If we can speak frankly for a moment, it has come to the media's discussion that they are not in this meeting for the third day. And are we understanding this correctly, that they is Ontario?
Yes, sir.
And so this is the third of your 3 attempts to table a tripart meeting, and the third time that Ontario is missing in action. And you refer to a statement from Ontario that your meetings will accomplish nothing. Is that what you're saying there? Is that what you'd heard from Ontario?
I believe that's what I'm referencing to. I don't have a memory of that statement at this moment,
Right.
but I think clearly my comment here is that there was a statement suggesting the table would accomplish nothing.
Right. And then there's a discussion between you and I take it that's you and the mayor.
Yes, sir. Myself, the mayor, I believe, as well. I believe the city manager and Minister Mendocino, of course, were on that call.
Right. And there's, you say good point, and then, sorry, the mayor says good point, and you say, you refine a point he's trying to make, and then the mayor says, in the third line, I can say that I'm disappointed that the province has not come to the table. Premier is telling me, and then he's quoting, it appears, what the Premier is telling him, anything you want, but then there is silence. Now, we've already heard from the mayor, and he's given his side of this, but from your perspective, were you disappointed that Ontario hadn't participated in these meetings so far, and was it your sense that the mayor was also disappointed that Ontario, at least at the level you would hope to have participation, hadn't shown up at the meetings?
Frankly, I had hoped that we would be able to convene the tripartite table as I had originally planned it. But I was, this was on the 10th. By that date, I was receiving assurances that, for example, Deputy Minister Stewart was in regular contact with his counterpart in Ontario, Deputy Minister Di Tommaso. And that there was ongoing discussions between my Government Operations Center, between the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, and between, as frankly, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Stewart, was acting as an interlocutor between both municipality and the province in these circumstances. And so, yes, a little disappointed that the minister wasn't able to attend, but quite gratified, frankly, and that there was now, I think, and my goal had been good communication between the 3 orders of government. I believe that was being achieved.
That is helpful. Thank you. And the other point, again, the mayor wasn't only, as you'll recall, because I think might say you got an earful from him as well. The mayor wasn't just disappointed in Ontario, and the notes, which I don't think you need to be taken to remember, because you probably had some of the same frustration experiencing these exchanges as one gets just reading them, which is the mayor seems very frustrated that he cannot get the support from either Ontario or from Ottawa in terms of boots on the ground in Ottawa, in particular federal, he'd be looking to you for commitments with respect to the RCMP. And there seems to be almost interminable confusion about how many are committed, how many are actually there, different ways of counting how many people are there. Were you able to participate usefully in that discussion? Did you have good lines of communication to the RCMP? Because it doesn't seem that much was being accomplished on that front in these meetings.
Minister Mendicino is the minister with direct lines of communication to the Commissioner of the RCMP and that organization. That's his responsibility. He was on this call and made a number of comments in response to the mayor's, as I recall, from those discussions. One of the things I tried to contribute to this discussion is that it wasn't just a numbers plan. It wasn't just about how many people. And in fact, I pointed out that it's actually difficult to start talking about specific numbers because, you know, the number of police officers to be deployed is a matter, frankly, of police confidentiality, and it can actually compromise police operations, in my experience. And so I cautioned about that. And so my recommendation is that we should be talking about resources. We should be talking about providing the support that the city needs without being specific about numbers. There had also been discussion, Mr. Cameron, throughout these tripartite meetings and in other fora, about the need for an integrated action plan, not just how many people were required, but how those people will then be utilized in order to effect the purpose of bringing the protest to a peaceful resolution.
Okay, well, that you've segued right into my next point, which is from your perspective, and we've heard a lot of police perspective from people similarly qualified already, but you were in a unique position here, so we'd benefit from your perspective on why it was, as you saw it, that there might have been some challenge for the OPP and the RCMP to commit resources to solving the problems that Ottawa was facing.
Yeah, to be very clear, sir, I was never briefed on any operational aspect of the plan. That would have been inappropriate. I never sought to be briefed on it, and I was not. But what we were seeking was assurances from those who did have operational responsibilities that they were satisfied with an integrated operational plan, an action plan, and that they were prepared to action it. That, I think, was a consideration because it's also useful to remember, I think, Mr. Cameron, there were a number of things happening right across the country at the time. You know, the OPP in particular were dealing with a difficult situation in Windsor. They had also had to respond to other events across Southern Ontario. Their resources were being quite significantly challenged because they had to continue to respond to a very dynamic and mobile threat across the country. And so my understanding was that, you know, they needed the clarity of an integrated command action plan that they'd all agreed to in order to facilitate the movement of people to go and deal with the situation in Ottawa.
And in that context, did you have a view as to whether there was any logical order of operations, if I can call it that way, in terms of where Ottawa should look to first? We have heard from Commissioner Lucky that she wasn't standing on protocol here. She was prepared to devote resources as quickly as she could while Ottawa sought help from the province as well. But putting aside those urgent first steps that were taken, did you have a sense of what the proper protocol was for Ottawa to follow in this context, putting in mind both the hat you were wearing as Minister of Emergency Preparedness and your history of having encountered similar situations, doubtless over many years in Toronto?
Yes, sir. To be very clear, there's a number of different ways in which this has been approached, particularly if there's a planned event. A planned event, as I've already mentioned, the G20 in 2010, there was another, planned event that I was involved in involving the visit of a U.S. president to the city of Ottawa. This happened in the early 2000s. That was a planned event where there was an integrated command structure put in place. At the time, I actually brought about 400 Toronto Police Service officers up here to Ottawa to work under that integrated command structure and to assist in public order for that event. I'm also aware, because frankly I've been around a long time, that there was always a very close working relationship between all of the police services working in the National Capital Region, they convene a table that they refer to as Intersect. I've had no dealings with it in the recent period, but I was familiar with it when I was a police chief, where the RCMP worked very closely with the Ottawa Police Service. I believe the OPP were at the table and the Gatineau Police. And so there's always been good cooperation among the police services in the National Capital Region. I'm also very familiar, I've been involved in very many incidents when I was a police officer, where we would, in the Toronto Police Service, we had, frankly, a lot of people. We had a lot of people trained in public order, and we would bring our public order resources to assist in Kingston, for example, for their homecoming event, in other towns around Ontario that didn't have those resources available to them, so we would go and assist. But there's also, and I'm aware, that within the Ontario Police Services Act, which is, frankly, the legislation that governs policing in the City of Ottawa and in the province of Ontario, there is a provision in that act that in circumstances that exceed the capacity of the police of jurisdiction, a municipal police service, to deal with an emergency, there is a provision within that act for the chief to make a request to the commissioner of the OPP, and the commissioner is required under that act to respond. You may also make a request to another municipal police service, and that municipal police service has the ability to decline. But there is a provision whereby a police service dealing with an emergency exceeding their capacity to manage can also, within the act, make an appeal and a request to the OPP. I believe that was done, in fact, in Windsor in response to the event at the Ambassador Bridge. It's a rarely used provision of the act, but it is a tool that was available.
You describe it as a tool that was available. Was it your view at the time, or is it your view now, that it was necessary for Ottawa to take that step before it came, the City of Ottawa to take that step before it came to the federal government for policing assistance?
Not if the police services, the OPP, the RCMP, and other police services were willing and able to send their people. Keeping in mind, it's a difficult thing to pull people from various jurisdictions, bring them to Ottawa for this type of a planned event. And that's an approach that had been used successfully in the past. If that could be facilitated, that could be used. And if it wasn't available to the chief, there was the tool within the Ontario Police Services Act.
Now, you described the use of either the formal use of the Police Services Act, or more likely, when you're talking about planned events, simply consensual arrangements where looking perhaps months or even years ahead to an event, you can get a multi-police organization team put together. That doesn't work if the event manifests itself over the course of a weekend. And so one thing that the commissioner might be interested in your views on is whether it would assist matters to have a protocol in place so that there isn't quite as much confusion and disagreement about whose responsibility it is, to who goes where and who provides what, to have a protocol in place and perhaps even stand by memoranda of understanding or something, so that it, within days rather than weeks, everybody knows who goes where, whose responsibilities are what, and the matter hopefully gets sorted out more quickly.
Yes, sir. I believe good communications, and to the extent that it is possible to plan for an unplanned event, those types of arrangement can be very useful. I've actually had the experience as a police chief making arrangements with other police services in the event of emergency, how many people I would send them and how quickly I'd be able to get them there. Because we all know that certain types of events can exceed any of our capacity to respond to an emergency. Planned events is actually pretty straightforward. And I believe that we've got a long history and a lot of success in dealing with, I'll stop saying we, sir, it's in my previous capacity. The police services have a long history of working very collaboratively together for planned events. And a number of different things are worked out well in advance, including the integrated command structure, who's going to be in charge, what they're often referred to as a gold silver command structure that is put in place, who's paying for what, and et cetera, what resources and obligations each of them will undertake to provide, is usually worked out well in advance. It is, quite frankly, more challenging in the event of an emergency, and made even more challenging when that emergency might be taking place in multiple jurisdictions.
All right. The speed with which you're able to deliver information, Minister Blair, is helpful, if not to the not to the translators, to me in getting through my questions in record time. So I'm flipping through some pages here. I want to ask you some questions about a related issue. You talked about Ipperwash. You had the probably not entirely pleasant experience of having a commission of inquiry look into the events of the G20. Not an entirely pleasant experience of having your conduct examined in a commission of inquiry. And one of the issues that came up in the Morden inquiry into the G20 event and in Ipperwash as well had to do with the extent of administrative oversight and political input to the activities of the police. And so with your long policing experience and your role now as a Minister of the Crown, can you start by giving us an overview of how you see either police board or other levels of government officialdom oversight of police, where you see that fits in, and how you view what has been called in this hearing so far sometimes the line between church and state, or the conundrum of how much police forces should resist political interference, and that whole topic.
Thank you, sir. And if I may, first of all, just a point of clarification. Justice Morden's report, although a very important report, was not a public inquiry. It was a report commissioned by the Toronto Police Services Board. In the aftermath of that report, there was also another public report done by the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, Mr. Jerry McNeely, also on that report, but also not a public inquiry.
Thank you.
One of the things I can share with you, sir, I was a police chief for 10 years. I was appointed by the Police Services Board. The Police Services Board is constituted under the Police Services Act. It's defined on its duties and responsibilities and how it's comprised. I very firmly believe, very sincerely believe, that good policing requires good governance. And governance is not to suggest, sir, that a Police Services Board or the governance authority will direct the police in their investigations, in their operations, will even direct them in the administration of their police service. That's not the function of good governance. The function of good governance, in my experience, is oversight and accountability. And I think it's fairly well articulated in a number of provincial statutes across the country, including the Ontario Police Services Act. In my own personal experience, I used to meet with my board every month for several hours over the course of a day. It was done in public. Some of it was in camera, much of it was in public. They would ask me questions about use of force. They would ask me about training. They would ask me about HR issues, the discipline and maintaining of conduct within my organization. I reported to them in a very public way about our engagement with diverse communities, about a number of efforts that we were making to prevent crime, all those things that were the responsibility of the police service to deliver adequate and effective police service. And that's actually directed at the board and then delegated to me by the board. The police have extraordinary authorities in our society, but those are not unfettered authorities. I think there's an expectation that we will be held to account for the way we use those authorities, and that there will be independent civilian oversight of policing activities. And I believe that's absolutely key. There is no good policing without good governance.
So sorry, slow down and say that again, please. There's no good
policing without good governance.
And when you use governance in this context, you're not talking about the police and his or her deputies. You're talking about some level
sir, I'm talking about independent civilian oversight of policing. the police chief answers to someone. I answered to my board. I worked for my board. And I was accountable to my board. And I understood that was my responsibility, to be accountable, to answer their questions. They were always very careful, by the way, and I can't recall at one incident in 10 years where they ever directed me in an investigation, in an operation, but they asked me a lot of questions about what we were doing and why we were doing it. I believe it was my responsibility to provide them with that information so that they could fulfill their function of providing oversight to me and to hold me accountable for the job that I was doing. And so I know there's been, because I've watched, there's been a lot of discussion about, having a civilian or a politician directing the police, and that's never acceptable. But at the same time, the police must be accountable to an independent civilian authority. Now that can be achieved through a government minister who's assigned for responsibility. It can be done through a police services board. But in my experience, policing is all predicated on public trust and the consent of the people who are policed. That trust is really warranted by that oversight and accountability and transparency and the way the extraordinary authorities given to the police are exercised.
Right. And in the time that you were chief of police and having this governance relationship with the police services board, would you have considered it interference, or what is sometimes called directing the police, for that board to have outlined to you either long-term or immediate priorities or rankings of objectives to accomplish with your available resources?
There are a number of different models of governance that are often employed by police service boards. One of them is through policies and priorities. I believe it's called the Carver model.
Slow down for the report again. The what model?
The Carver model. I've actually spent a lot of time. I also felt it was my responsibility to help my board be a good board, because they would help me be a good chief. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how they could do their job and that would help me do my job as a board. And I think it was a very effective relationship. They did set priorities for the service. They also set my budget. I would collaborate with them and work very closely with them, and they would consult with the public on what those priorities should be, because there is a bridge that a governance body can serve for a police service to be that connection on behalf of community. And so they would bring, there was lots of community deputations made at our board meetings where people would outline their expectations and their concerns, and the board would set priorities. But my board was also very careful not to cross a line into operational matters, to suggest where we should deploy people or what investigations or what laws would be enforced. They never went there. And neither would, frankly, I have allowed them. I'd have pushed back on that. But they often talked about, placing a greater emphasis on community policing, on community outreach, on building greater diversity within the police service, and how we interact with, the incredible diverse population of our city, and issues of crime prevention and how communities were to be policed. And frankly, I never considered those infringements on police operations. I just thought we were working together to do good policing.
And what about when that effort at direction from the Police Services Board was aimed at a more immediate situation? And I don't mean a particular investigation or anything of that type, but for example, if the Tamil protest had shut down University Avenue for 4 days, would you have considered it out of line for the Police Services Board to ask you what you intended to do about it and express to you their view that they considered this a serious problem for the city?
I would have considered it entirely appropriate. And frankly, I recall getting these questions from the board. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? There was a fair bit of criticism, as you can imagine. As a matter of fact, some of the national papers were accusing me of being overly tolerant. My board was very supportive of what we were doing, but they did ask questions about what and why, which I considered entirely appropriate. But at no time did they tell me how to police that community. And I think for me, there's a bright line there. And they didn't cross that line, but they held me to account to the decisions I was making on how I was going to deliver policing services in those circumstances. And I didn't consider their questions infringements on any aspect of my authority and responsibility. It was my job to answer their questions and to allow them to perform that oversight role and to hold me accountable for the decisions I made.
So that's very helpful. Now, I'm going to ask you to see if you can direct those thoughts to the, I don't know if unique is the right word, but at least the different situation of the RCMP, which doesn't have a police services board structure to which it is accountable. The commissioner reports to the minister and has a relatively thin statutory framework that delineates that relationship. Have you had some thoughts about what you're calling governance of the RCMP could and should look like if it's different than it currently is now?
Yes, sir. And in fact, it actually appeared in my mandate letter when I was the Minister of Public Safety, that we were looking at the issue of governance. I also had some responsibility. I have a keen interest in the delivery of First Nations policing program across the city, and we're working towards the development of a new legislative framework for First Nations policing in Canada. In order to make sure that that's as effective as it can be, I believe we have to resolve the issue of governance in those communities, give people a say in how they're going to be policed. That doesn't mean they get to direct the police operations, but they can make decisions about how the police will function within their communities. And I would also make the observation in a number of jurisdictions across the country, we sometimes see the tension that exists for the contract policing across this country. But very often, it's an issue of governance. And I'll just cite, if I may, I also recall vividly, in Ontario, there were a number of police or communities that had their own little small police services who made a decision to go and contract with the Ontario Provincial Police to deliver policing services in their community. And I witnessed the OPP make a very strong effort to give those communities governance authority over their detachment and to meet regularly with the local officials and to actually give them a say in how they're going to be policed. I thought it was very thoughtful, and I also believe that model, which I'm familiar with Ontario, could assist us in improving the quality of policing right across the country, particularly in contract areas and in particular in First Nations.
And do you have any specific recommendations, or I shouldn't say specific in the sense of drafting legislative terms, but what a more complete governance structure would look like for the RCMP?
I think there's a number of models to be considered. I also want to be respectful. This is the responsibility now of my friend and colleague, Minister Mendicino.
But
he is the minister.
If you want to stop there, then we're going to hear from him shortly.
But at the same time, I have obviously some thoughts on the matter, and I'm more than happy to share that with Minister Mendicino. I think ultimately it's going to lead to better policing, which is our collective goal.
Right. Now, there were a couple of times, and you might remember them. I'm going to bring you to one in particular where you made comments to the effect of the police just need to do their job. In other words, you made comments that gave the public the impression that you didn't think the police were doing as much as they could to deal with the situations in both Ottawa and elsewhere in the country. The Ottawa ones, I think you're familiar with, and we've heard a lot from the OPS and about their reaction to your comments. So let me just begin there. Did you have the impression that the Ottawa police were not doing as much as they could or should have, or perhaps as early as they should have, to deal with the situation that they encountered when the convoy arrived in Ottawa?
I think initially their response was incorrect. Was incorrect. I think, and based on the intelligence that they had, I think allowing those trucks into the downtown core to establish themselves and become essentially very large barricades, in hindsight, and I appreciate this is the clarity of my hindsight, but I believe that was a mistake. And I think they would acknowledge that it would be better had that not happened. But once that actually happened, they were dealing with what, in my experience, would be a unique set of circumstances, a uniquely challenging set of circumstances, which was extremely challenging. And in fairness to them, my concern and the statements I made, frankly, it was not my intention to criticize the police. It was to encourage them to utilize the tools that were available to them. Because again, I've spent most of my life telling police officers to do their job. And I have every confidence in them. I'm very proud of my profession. I'm very proud of the men and women who do that work. And I was just trying to encourage them. We, as a society, needed the police because they're the only ones empowered to deal with these public order events, and we needed them to do what was required to bring it to a peaceful resolution. And I was simply commenting that we needed them to do that job.
Okay, and I'll ask the clerk, if I can read this, to call up SSM NSC CAN 403129. Minister Blair, this will be a text exchange between you and Zita Astravis, your Chief of Staff. And of course, you can see the words that caught our attention when your office sent the commission this document among all the others. And that is your comment, the police are finally doing their job in Windsor. And we'll go on to the next paragraph in a second, but had it been your impression that the situation in Windsor was taking longer than it should have to resolve because the police were not doing their job?
And again, not something I would have ever said to the police because it's not, I don't believe that would have been appropriate. But personally, I believe that the impact of the blockades at the Ambassador Bridge were being hugely impactful, not just economically, but auto plants were being shut down right across the province. There was a huge impact that was taking place. People were being laid off. They were being sent home. Factory floors were being idled. And I believe there was a sense of urgency to resolve that. I respect, the operational commanders. I wasn't second guessing them, certainly to them, but I was frankly relieved that they were, in my opinion, finally resolving that. I also had every expectation, as I indicate in that note, that they would do everything to avoid violence, that they would be measured and proportional and professional, because I know those guys, and I have every confidence in their work. But I was very much seized with a strong sense of urgency about the blockades at that particular location because I believe that they had been so impactful.
And do you recollect any view you had about the liaison efforts? And we're looking now at the second paragraph where you say it appears they, presumably the police, Windsor Police Force and the OPP and RCMP who are acting here.
Headed up by an integrated command structure.
It appears they didn't actually need to offer terms and concessions to the protesters. Can you explain what you were thinking there, if you remember?
I don't really recall, except, again, I was feeling a sense of relief that they were now clearing that bridge, because it did strike me as a matter of urgency, and previous tactics had not been effective in clearing the blockade.
Right. I'm going to move to a different topic. So before I leave, is there anything more you'd like to say about those topics that we've just been covering about police governance, about the effectiveness of the police operations in Ottawa? I'm not expecting any more from you, but I'm just about to change topics, and so I'd offer you that.
Let us change topics, sir. I'm fine.
Okay. Although you might not like to change the topic, it's to the Alberta RFA. You'll recollect that, I think, and police can you just
governance
to those
about,
who haven't followed the proceedings quite as closely,
effectiveness of the
maybe
police
as the rest of us,
operations
can you just outline what that was about and
Um,
how it came across your desk? I'm not expecting any
Yes,
more
sir.
from you, but I'm just
And
about
I
to
don't
change
recall
topics. And
precisely
so I
whether
offer
the
you
letter
that.
arrived
change
first or I
topics,
heard from Deputy Minister Stewart.
Although you
But
might
I
not
became
like to
aware,
change the topic, it's
that
to the
there-
Alberta
there was a
RFA.
request from the province of Alberta, and I believe it was from Minister Rick
You'll
McIver,
recollect that.
stating a number of things about what was transpiring in Alberta with respect to the Coutts blockade. The Coutts blockade had been going on for some time, and among the things that Mr. McIver was asking for, he made a number of comments, but his primary ask was for access, and he was very specific, to Canadian Armed Forces tow trucks, I believe, in order to assist in the movement of trucks that were blockading the highway in southern Alberta at Coutts. And so immediately, because he was asking for Canadian Armed Forces resources and personnel in order to respond to this, that request I forwarded to the Department of National Defense and to Minister Anand, because it didn't fall under any of our existing agreements. So it would have been something that, first of all, we'd have to hear from the Canadian Armed Forces whether or not they had equipment fit for purpose, and it would also require the approval of the Minister of National Defense. And so that information went on over to them. I also recall a number of days later being advised by Deputy Minister Stewart that the Canadian Armed Forces advised that they did not have equipment fit for purpose and didn't believe that they would be able to respond to that request. The advice I received from the Deputy Minister at that time is that we should simply advise Alberta that we weren't able to respond positively to their request for assistance. We always endeavor to try to do our best, but there have been a few occasions when we've had to say, no, we just don't have that equipment. But I did ask the Deputy Minister and some of my own staff to explore, again, from a whole of government standpoint, did we have any other resources that we can draw upon? I was quite reluctant to just say no. And so we looked at other departments and agencies, Parks Canada, Transport Canada. I even had people checking to see if we could access trucks in the United States that could have been brought across the border to assist. And ultimately, I was advised no, and that they weren't able to do that. I then asked, because Mr. McIver had called me and wanted an answer to the question. And I said to my people, we have to have a formal response to Mr. McIver. A letter was produced. I approved it. I was concerned that, again, we were saying no, but I approved it. Also making an offer because he had indicated that they were going to purchase some of their own vehicles at that point in time, that the federal government would assist in paying for those vehicles. And eventually a letter was approved, and I signed off on it thereafter. It goes back to officials to be sent. I understand in my subsequent messaging with Minister McIver that he never received that letter. I have no explanation for that.
And we've heard an explanation from your staff, so I won't ask you to expand on that. But if we could, it might give some more insight on that process if we looked at another document. So, Mr. Clerk, could you call up SSM CAN NSC 402689? And if the system is working, this will be the unredacted version of a document that has been redacted to the parties until just about right now. And you can see there's a, we're at February 11th here at this exchange of emails. And the email we're looking at right now is from Ms. Astravas, and she's recording that the PMO is approved, and this we're going to find out when we go down here, is followed by an email from you, and I'll suggest to you, you might recognize it, but you're commenting here on the response to Alberta. And if I've got that right, what you're saying is it's a weak response. That is the response you or the federal government is giving to Alberta. It's a weak response, but all we have, I approve, please advise Alberta. And if I've correctly characterized that as your message in relation to the response to the RFA, why were you describing it as a weak response?
Because I wanted to help Alberta. And we had examined all of our options, and we weren't able to provide them with the equipment that they sought. And so a letter was prepared. I believe it indicated our willingness to provide them with financial assistance for what they were requiring. But at this point in time, we weren't able to provide them with the trucks that they sought. I had hoped we would be able to. And so I thought it a weak response. But I also thought it was equally important that we respond and that we advise Alberta of the position that we were in, and that in particular that CAF had advised, the Canadian Armed Forces had advised that their equipment wasn't appropriate, and they did not, it requires their approval, and they didn't give that approval.
Okay, so one reading of it's a weak response would be, we, the federal government, don't have a good rationale for denying this RFA. That is, it's a weak response to Alberta, but that's not how you intended those words to read.
No,
you meant it's a...
Not at all, sir. And frankly, we didn't have the equipment. The rationale was pretty straightforward. We don't have the equipment that you've asked us for. The Canadian Armed Forces said it's not fit for purpose, and they're unable to provide it. And you know, that is exactly what it is, sir.
So you would say it was a complete and logical response, but it was unfortunate in that it was you weren't able to deliver anything.
My strong preference would have been to help Alberta.
Yeah. Now, moving chronologically through events to the consideration of the Emergencies Act as it came up, you participated in the SSE meetings and then the IRG meetings when the forum transitioned to the IRG. Were you present at or represented at all of those meetings?
I was present at all of them, sir.
Thank you. And if you can describe in general what was Cabinet, or at least those of members of Cabinet who were gathered in those meetings, looking to you for, and what were you able to contribute to the meetings?
First of all, in the Safety, Security, and Emergency Committee that I chair, it's a smaller group of Cabinet ministers that regularly convene, although each of these meetings was what I refer to as ad hoc. It was beyond our regular schedule of meetings, but I brought them together in order to receive briefings from, depending on the officials, Deputy Minister Stewart, Commissioner Lucky, the NSIA advisor, to provide information to my Cabinet colleagues, also to discuss the appropriate government response. I also took the opportunity during these meetings, and I think what I was able to contribute was to provide them with an understanding, because of my policing background, with the policing environment that governed this event, and as the event unfolded over the course of a number of days, about what, again, the policing environment, not just in Ottawa, but in various locales in Alberta, British Columbia, in Manitoba, and a number of points of entry in Ontario.
Right. Now, I have a particular question that comes out of something we discussed in the interview, and that I believe you have a view on. You were participating in these meetings. As events were coming to a head, we had IRG meetings coming up towards the IRG meeting immediately before invocation on the 13th. And I'm going to get, in your interview summary, which the parties have already seen, you outline the reasons that you thought were certainly bearing on your thoughts as you were contemplating the propriety of invocation. But there was a particular sub-point that I wanted to ask you about, which was whether you were aware of, because I think you've probably heard about now, at the time you were contemplating this and ultimately giving your input to the Prime Minister on the 13th, whether you were aware of Commissioner Lucky's views that she thought that there were still law enforcement tools available to the RCMP to deal with the situation in Ottawa and elsewhere in Canada?
I don't believe I was aware of that on the 13th.
Right. Or before?
Or before.
Yes.
I've obviously subsequently become aware of it, and we've talked about, you've asked me about it, but I don't recall being aware of it
Right.
prior to that.
And as I'll just, to be clear, despite having been at all of the SSE and IRG and ultimately cabinet meetings that were considering invocation, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, can we come to your four? You don't have to do them off by heart, although you might remember them. I can help guide you through them. But as I recollected from our interview with you, you had categorized the reasons that you thought invocation of the act was important. And as I don't want you to characterize these necessarily as the advice you gave cabinet, because that would be a confidence of cabinet. So if you can just describe them to us as how you were viewing the matter as you were contemplating invocation. Yes, sir.
If I may, the situation in Ottawa had been enormously challenging for the people of Ottawa. And I think people were living in a state of fearfulness and intimidation. And frankly, I think it was a very difficult set of circumstances for them there. And I was aware of that and, obviously anxious to resolve that. But I remained hopeful throughout. And I'd like to also sort of be clear to characterize, I believe very much the Emergency Act was a measure of last resort, and that it was incumbent upon us to, first of all, either exhaust all existing authorities or acknowledge that they would not be successful and could not be used for a number of different reasons. And we were hearing that type of feedback from law enforcement about the enormous challenges they were facing. We were also hearing about how stretched their resources were being pulled because of events that were taking place in different parts of the country that required them to respond to one place but then be required in other places. And that was a challenge that we were hearing quite frequently as well. But I will also tell you I became very concerned because one of my responsibilities as the Minister for Emergency Preparedness is the resiliency and safety and security of critical infrastructure. And we define critical infrastructure as 10 different sectors of critical infrastructure. And in particular, as it relates to this event, it includes such things as manufacturing, our transportation routes, the essential supply lines, the movement of essential workers. And what I was witnessing at the Ambassador Bridge, at Coots, at Emerson, and then in a number of different venues that I would where we would see similar activity being threatened to be done at Point Edwards, at the Peace Bridge, at the Pacific Highway in British Columbia, that escalation, and I viewed as a significant escalation because it did result in significant disruption of critical supply lines, the cutting off of essential goods and services, the impact that it was having, not just economically, but on people, on families, and people were being laid off their jobs, and factories were being idled. I was also concerned because I'm aware, being a person from Ontario, that the integrated manufacturing processes in Ontario, particularly in the auto sector, but in many other manufacturing sectors as well. Prior to being public safety minister, I was also the Minister of Border Security, and so it really did give me an understanding and appreciation of how important the integrity and functioning of that border is to our prosperity, to our economy, and to the well-being and health and safety of Canadians. And so when those borders were essentially closed, and that the movement of goods and services, particularly some of the parts that go into our factories, was being essentially stopped, it was hugely impactful. And I believe that it had risen to the level of a national emergency. We were also seeing, frankly, the information that we received from the RCMP on or around February 10th that they believed that there were firearms present at Coots. And then subsequently, I believe on the 13th and 14th, when they completed their criminal investigation and arrested people and seized a number of firearms, it also, for me, elevated concern about public safety and the risk that not everyone involved in these protests represented, but embedded within these protests, the possibility, certainly in Alberta, of violence and even serious violence. taking place. And so for me, the impact that it was having, not just in the city of Ottawa, but I don't want to minimize what was going on in Ottawa by any stretch of the imagination, but right across the country, particularly as it pertains to critical infrastructure, for me, elevated the situation to a national emergency. I would also observe as well, I believed that there was strong evidence that what was the fact that this protest was so well entrenched in blockades in Ottawa really anchored what was taking place even right across the country. There was, in my mind, a clear correlation between the activities of border blockades and what was taking place in Ottawa. And it also, for me, highlighted the need. We had to resolve the whole situation, and failure to do so failure to resolve in Ottawa would have resulted just continue to, like whack-a-mole, chasing border blockades from one point of entry to another. There are 119 border points of entry, land border points of entry in this country, plus our airports, and all of them are vulnerable to this type of unlawful action. And in my opinion, that represented a serious threat to our national security and became a national emergency.
And when you describe your observation that the impact on the critical infrastructure elevated the situation, that the blockades, the convoy, the protests, et cetera, elevated that to a national emergency, when you say that the impact on the critical infrastructure, when I think of infrastructure, I think of physical built bridges and roads and trains and things like that, but I don't think there was any actual harm to those. So I take it you're talking about the impact on trade and the economy and people in the vicinity, their lives, things like that, not the infrastructure itself.
When an artery, a point of entry into the country, in Manitoba, in Alberta, in Ontario, is essentially rendered dysfunctional, when it's closed and nothing is moving through there, the movement of those goods and services, in my opinion, is part of our critical infrastructure. It supports manufacturing. It's part of the transportation. But you don't have to blow everything up to render it unusable.
Right.
And that can be done through cyber attack, for example. But rendering it unusable is an attack on critical infrastructure, in my opinion. And that's precisely what happened in these circumstances. And it was, for me, we'd seen bridges and highways and rail lines go down in the floods and storms in British Columbia. We knew we had to work hard to get those reopened, but the situation across this country, it was exacerbated by the very significant challenges the police were obviously having to clear these in a timely way.
Right. And if I can remind you, you had a fourth, believe it or not, you just did go through three of your factors that they sort of got lumped together, but your fourth had to do with your view on whether or not the existing legal authorities were adequate, whether they had been exhausted, et cetera. What was your view there?
Yes, sir. One of the things that, I can go through a bit of a list, one of the things we'd heard in Alberta, in Manitoba, in British Columbia, and certainly in Ottawa and at the Ambassador Bridge, was the very significant challenges that the police were having in gaining access to vehicles that they could tow, the large trucks that were being used basically to blockade. They almost ceased to be trucks. They were fortresses and very, very difficult to move. There were a number of reasons why that I think have been articulated for this commission as to why they couldn't gain access to those, but it was a reality that they could not. I looked very carefully, by the way, on the Friday when Ontario brought in their measures. They did attempt to address making those tow trucks available, at least in Ontario, but it only authorized the use of the truck. It did not compel it, and so I was concerned that, given the circumstances and what I believe to be the reasons why those trucks weren't available to the police to clear the blockades, either at Ambassador Bridge or in Ottawa, that we needed to do something else. I'm also aware, in a previous part of my police career, I was very much involved in organized crime and money laundering investigations, and so I am familiar with the authorities and the activities of FinTrack And one of the questions that, we had as a government is, where is this money coming from and how is it being used? I became aware that FinTrack did not have existing authorities to provide us with that information. And so that was, in my opinion, a deficiency in existing authorities and something that we needed to consider how we might be able to address it. There were also a number of areas, like one of the things when Ambassador Bridge, as an example, was blockaded. One of the first things I did is I dug out the International Bridges and Tunnels Act to see what authorities we had, but the authorities within that act were limited only to the bridge. And as you recall, the blockades in Windsor didn't set up on the bridge or even in their primary points of access. It was further down the road. It was very effective in closing down that bridge, but it happened to be on a municipal roadway, which is governed by municipal bylaw and the Ontario Highway Traffic Act, but not really effectively by any federal statute. And so the ability to designate certain spaces, that also became relevant in the city of Ottawa, I think, for Wellington Street and the Sir John A. Parkway, in order to, it became necessary to designate certain spaces where those activities would not be prohibited. And so there were a number of circumstances where the normal tools that the police would rely on, either in municipal statute, in provincial statute, or municipal bylaw, provincial statute, or in federal statute, were not being able, they could not use them effectively to resolve this in a peaceful way. And we listened very carefully to the challenges that we were facing, and I came to believe that we needed to find a remedy to provide them with the tools that they required in order to effect the purpose of bringing these protests to an end.
Okay, and coming to the end of our time and to the end of the part of the story that the Commission hopes to have you talk about, you observed, not as a police participant, but as an experienced public order commander, the enforcement action that eventually came to pass in Ottawa when the plan, Joint Forces Plan, was implemented. Did you have observations about the propriety, effectiveness, timeliness, et cetera, of the police action once the plan was in place?
Yes, sir, I did. And I can tell you, it restored my pride in my profession. I have great respect and admiration for the men and women who do that very difficult job of policing. And what I witnessed, certainly in the city of Ottawa, but in other jurisdictions as well, but particularly in the city of Ottawa, an entirely professional, proportional, measured response. They moved slowly, methodically, respectfully. It was very clear that they were well trained, very clear they were well led. I believe that their exercise of the authorities that they had, both in existing law and in the new regulations, was done in a very measured and careful way. And I've seen some video of how they've done it. It was textbook. Like I've been trained as a public order commander, and I've seen it done well, and I've never seen it done better than what I witnessed here in the city of Ottawa, as they, I think, to the extent possible, as peacefully as possible, brought this to a resolution. They allowed people, for example, points of egress. It's always important to let people have a space to go. They did that work. They moved slowly. I actually found myself trying to explain to some of my friends that why they're going slowly, because that's the right way to do it. And in my opinion, they did it the right way.
Okay. Thank you, Minister Blair, and thank you, Commissioner. Those are the questions of Commission Council. I think pretty close to on time.
I think you have 10 minutes left.
Oh, there you go.
You can think up new questions, I'm sure. We're happy to share them. So this may be a good time for the afternoon break then, and we can come back in 15 minutes to go into the cross-examinations.
The Commission is in recess for 15 minutes. La Commission est levée pour 15 minutes. Order allowed. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Minister, good morning, or good afternoon. Good afternoon, long week. My name is Brendan Miller, and I'm counsel to Freedom Corp, which is the entity that represents the protesters that were in Ottawa January and February of 2022. If we could please bring up document ssm.can.0006358_rel.0001.
Council, is that 1658?
6358, 6358. So if we can scroll to the last page, please. Have you seen this email before, sir? The last page, please.
No, sir, I don't recall.
Okay. So this email is from January 27, 2022 at 4:21 p.m. You can agree with me that the protesters in Ottawa didn't arrive here until the 28th. Is that fair?
That's my understanding, yes, sir.
All right. So they're already preparing the narrative that they're going to label the protesters with. Can you scroll down, please? And there I put this to the last witness as well. Our government recognizes and respects that everyone in Canada has the right to safe and peaceful protest. Threatening acts of violence and inciting hatred, as we have seen from a select few in recent days, is unacceptable and does not reflect the views of the majority of Canadians. We condemn all such hateful and violent rhetoric in strongest terms. So can you agree with me that that labeling of the protesters had already been set out on January 27th?
Sir, I don't know the context of this email or frankly where it comes from.
Okay, if we can scroll up. Okay, scroll up to the top, please. So this is with your chief of staff, and they're agreeing about how they're going to set the narrative for the protest. And if you scroll down again, they confirm with one another that this is what they're going to do. So can you agree with me again that by January 27th, 2022, essentially all your colleagues and yourselves had agreed that there'd be a joint government response, and this was how you're going to deal with it. You were going to label the protesters violent, to incite hate, hateful, violent rhetoric. That was the intention on January 27th, correct?
No, sir, I disagree.
Okay.
There is no agreement here. It's recommendation from someone on staff.
Right. If we could bring up document ssm.can.00007719_rel.0001. So, sir, I can tell you these are the notes of Miss Sarah Jackson. I take it you know Sarah Jackson is the office manager to the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister. Is that correct?
I know of her. I don't believe we've met face to face.
Right. And you know who Katie Telford is?
Yes, sir.
And she's the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister.
Yes, sir.
All right. Can we scroll down to page 3, please? All right. So you'll see that this note, it's the notes from Ms. Jackson. It says February 4th, KT call. So I'm sure you can agree with me that KT, that's Katie Telford. Is that correct?
I have no idea, sir.
Okay. So let's scroll down to page 4, please. And there at the note on February 4th, 2022, it says Blair Strategy Emergency Act. You see that?
Yes, sir, I see it.
Yeah, because it was your strategy on February 4th, 2022 to get the Emergencies Act invoked, was it not?
No, sir, that's incorrect.
So why would, in a conversation, to your knowledge, why would Ms. Jackson record that in a meeting with Ms. Telford? Why would she do that, to your knowledge?
I have no idea, sir. I can tell you I recall the meeting in which I talked about the need for the police of jurisdiction to exhaust their existing authorities and that we needed to support them. I also made it very clear to colleagues that the Emergency Act was a measure of last resort and not appropriate at this time. That was the conversation I had in the fourth.
And can you agree with me, though, that if there was a strategy to invoke the Emergencies Act, that if the purported emergency resolves itself on its own, of course, there's no reason to invoke it, correct?
Again, sir, there was no strategy to invoke the Act. There was a discussion among colleagues about the various options that were available, and I was very explicit to my colleagues that the Emergency Act was not under consideration at this time. And that was on February 4th.
But you had said on Global News on the 13th, at 8 o'clock on the 13th, you had told them, and I have the transcript if you'd like me to repeat it. You said that the Emergencies Act was under consideration from the outset. Do you want me to read the transcript to you?
To be really clear, I believe what I said is, and you can read whatever you like, by the way, but what I believe I said is everything was on the table and we were considering every option throughout. That is the responsibility of those of us.
Sir, what you actually said was that it was under consideration from the first day. That's what you said. Would you like me to show you the transcript?
That might be useful.
Okay. If we could bring up the support documents, it, I believe, is in there.
You're referring to HRF 401622, right, Council?
Yes, sir.
Well, do we have the actual reference? Maybe your associate can tell us what the reference is in the database.
Well, I don't want to slow this down, so I'll move on and come back to that. So, sir, we'll come back to what you said. But by February 4th of 2022, you agree that the Prime Minister and Minister Mendocino had already labeled the protesters in Ottawa as extremists. Is that correct?
I have no knowledge of that. I don't agree with that.
But you can agree that on January 31st, 2022, the Prime Minister addressed the nation on TV and on the internet by video. Do you remember that?
No, sir.
You don't remember that?
No, sir.
When the Prime Minister went on television to the whole nation and talked about the Ottawa protest on the following Monday. You don't remember that?
I know the Premier spoke. I have no recollection of what he said. I was busy doing things.
Well, I'm going to read you what he said, and you can tell me if you remember it. And he stated, I know you are wondering about what you saw in our capital city this weekend. As my friend Erwin Cotter said on Saturday's Freedom of Expression, assembly and association of the cornerstones of democracy, but Nazi symbolism, racist imagery, and desecration of war memorials are not. It is an insult to memory and truth. Hate can never be the answer. Over the past few days, Canadians were shocked and frankly disgusted by the behavior displayed by some people protesting in the nation's capital. I want to be very clear. We are not intimidated by those who hurl insults and abuse at small business works and steal food from the homeless. We won't give in to those who fly racist flags. We won't cave to those who engage in vandalism and dishonor the memory of our veterans. There is no place in our country for threats, violence, and hatred. So to those responsible for this behavior, it needs to stop. To anyone who joined the convoy but is rightly uncomfortable with the symbols of hatred and division on display, join with your fellow Canadians, be courageous, and speak out. Do not stand for or with intolerance or hate. Do you remember hearing that now?
Actually, now that you've read it to me, sir, I not only remember it, but I agree with it.
Okay. And so you can agree there that the Prime Minister has stated that being part of the protest is essentially standing with intolerance and hate. Can you agree with that?
I don't believe that was the distinction the Prime Minister made. He was actually telling people who don't agree with those measures not to stand with those who do.
Right. And I take it you know that when the protesters arrived on January 28th up to February 1st, that the evidence to date is that they were largely and completely peaceful and that there was little to no violence. Do you agree with that?
And again, I think I think there might have been isolated incidents, and frankly, I also believe the carrying of hateful symbols, like a Nazi flag, is in many ways causing fear, and it is a form of violence and intimidation against people who would be caused to be very fearful about such symbols in their community.
And so the bearer of the Nazi flag, that is a person who is hateful, and it is someone that the government of Canada is concerned about. Is that fair?
Again, I don't know the person who was bearing the flag, and I wouldn't comment on that, but I know how hurtful a Nazi flag can be to very many Canadians who, in their life experience, that's a symbol of anti-Semitism, hatred,
I understand.
and fear.
And so I understand that you're also, though, you're familiar with the company Enterprise Canada. It does work for the Liberal Party of Canada.
I'm not, sir.
Are you familiar with Suprad Davini? Does that sound familiar?
I'm not, sir.
Are you familiar with a Mr. Brian Fox?
No, sir.
Have you heard anything about the individual carrying the Nazi flag actually not being a protester, but somebody sent there so that photos were taken? Have you heard anything about that?
Only from you, sir.
Okay. And we'll just come back to the issue with the labeling then. I take it, though, that you consulted your comms people on the narrative that you wanted the media to accept before the protesters even got here, according to that email?
No, sir, that's not correct.
That email states that they were buying the narrative. That's what it states.
With respect, sir, I believe what the email says is that some of our communications people were examining and being prepared for the event coming, but no decision had been made. None of that was presented to me, and it did not form any of my messaging.
Can you agree that from the protesters' arrival, at least after February 4th, you intended and wanted the protesters removed by force, didn't you?
Absolutely not, sir. I wanted the protest to end and them to be removed, but I've always been committed to doing that as peaceably and proportionally as possible.
But you couldn't talk to them after they had been labeled these extremists, because your colleagues and yourself, of course, extremism, Nazis, terrorists, you can't talk to that sort of group, can you? It would look bad, wouldn't it?
I would actually disagree with your characterization. In various points of my life, sir, I've engaged with people who are engaged in protest, and so frankly, I disagree with your characterization.
So on February 7th, 2022, when the mayor of Ottawa asked the federal government and yourself to bring in a mediator to meet with the protesters, do you remember what you said to your chief of staff in response to that?
No, sir. Perhaps you could share it with me.
If we can bring up document SSM.NSC.CAN.0003070_rel.0001. So this is your response to finding out about the request for a mediator. And you respond as follows. I don't know who is advising Mayor Watson, but this is a bad mistake. He has conceded without ever using the many tools available to the city. His language is also problematic. This is not a labor dispute between interests. It's an unlawful occupation. As long as the city and its police refuse to do anything, no progress will be possible. So I take it at the time when you wrote that to your chief of staff, that was how you felt, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right.
That's an email from myself to my chief of staff.
Correct. And so it's fair to say that you did not want to bring in a mediator.
I was concerned about the intention of the mediation and what was being negotiated. In my experience, the intent of engaging with protesters is to bring a peaceful resolution to the protest.
Yes, but also then on February 11th of 2022, you were given a copy of the engagement proposal that Inspector Bedoin of the OPP and Deputy Minister Stewart had drafted, right? You were emailed a copy.
You'll have to share it with me, sir, to help me recall.
If we can bring up document SSM.can.0006131_rel.0001. If we can scroll down to the bottom. And so This is attached as the draft for your review and comments. I have validated the proposed approach with the OPP expert and since shared the draft, but no word back yet. And that is from Deputy Minister Rob Stewart. And it is on February 11th, 2022 at 12 p.m. And if we can go up, and we can keep going. It is then forwarded to you by your Chief of Staff, Astravas Zita. And then it appears, if we can scroll up, you have a response, but it's redacted under Section 39 of the Canada Evidence Act. Now, can you agree with me that your Chief of Staff, she's not a member of Cabinet?
That's correct.
Right. So what was your response here?
I don't recall.
You don't recall. Would it be helpful to the commission if we had your response?
I don't know because I don't know. I don't recall the response.
You don't recall the response? But given that it's an engagement proposal and in the meeting when you actually had it before you, there's notes to the effect that this isn't action, we want action. Is it fair to say that both yourselves, including the Prime Minister and Minister Mendocino, you were never on any terms going to carry out any such proposal that would essentially require you to go and talk to the protesters? Were you?
No, sir. I don't agree with anything you've just said.
So you had always been open to meeting with the protesters?
We were, and Deputy Stewart had advised that he was involved in a process of engagement with the protesters. But I frankly, I was not in favor of having senior ministers of government go out and engage with the protesters. In my experience, that's done at an officials level and not involving cabinet ministers.